Welcome. I have the great honor of introducing the next speaker for this additional keynote in this really wonderful workshop. This Bissel-Heyd workshop. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm very, very glad to be a colleague of Connor Ewing. My wife said that this is the only blazer I had in my closet that would make me look better than Connor, so I wore it today. So Connor, there you go. I'll let you buy it off me when this whole thing is done. I've got the great pleasure of introducing one of the leading lights of American political development and the study of American politics, and indeed one of the really serious heavyweights in political science more broadly globally. So it's a real honor for us to have him here today. And I want to just say, just to put a little bit of context on it, it's a real honor for the Munk School to be hosting this workshop, for it to be funded through some funds that we hold at the Center for the Study of the United States. It's an honor to be hosting it because we have for some time been trying to do our little part on this side of the border to advance the study of political development as systematically and broadly and ambitiously as it's been done in the United States by people like Rogers and others. I do want to acknowledge that one of the people who's been very, very key in that is Rob Vipend, who is sitting over there. And Rob, we really appreciate all of your great efforts in that intellectual leadership. And I won't name all the other people in the room who have been contributors to that because it's more than I have time for. I'm here to introduce Roger Smith. I think you know him, but if you don't, I will tell you that he's the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Penn Arts and Science. He is, among other things, elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as a fellow in 2004, a fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science in 2011, and a member of the American Philosophical Society in 2016, which, as you know, was on a very long decline ever since its founding by Benjamin Franklin, but in 2016, Rogers turned it around, and it's good of him to have done that. So he was also, very importantly, the president of the American Political Science Association in 2018 and 2019, and did that job, which is not an easy one, very, very well. So I won't say anything else except that it's a real honor, Rogers, to have you here, and I want to invite you to the podium to give your talk on America's conflicting constitutional visions, the quest for common ground. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Connor and Sophie and everyone who helped organize this conference. Like Connor, I'm also going to thank all of you for coming. I am sucking up to you, but you deserve it. I'm a bit embarrassed, actually, to be one of the keynote speakers here because the truth is that after the first decade of my career, my interest shifted, and I didn't write primarily about American constitutional law, but I have thought and taught about American constitutionalism all through my career with growing concern as time has gone on. And this talk arises out of those concerns. It considers, given our constitutional conflicts today, whether we can find some common ground for moving the American constitutional enterprise forward. And to jump to the punchline, I will suggest that if we are to find common ground, we need to join those scholars who are insisting that we give greater centrality to the second founding of the United States, the Reconstruction Amendments, as our guides in American constitutionalism. But before I get to that argument, I want to lay out a view of our current problems. And they begin with the reality you're all aware of, that over the last 30 years, we have had heightening polarization in American politics, so that the gap between the median Democrat and the median Republican has grown, with especially Republicans moving more toward sharply conservative positions. And this polarization is resulting in paralysis in governance and sometimes in violence. Now, some analysts trace this polarization in part to conflicting constitutional conceptions. And I don't believe polarization can be traced entirely to clashing constitutional visions, but I do think that rival visions of the Constitution are shaping the conduct of our courts, our intellectual and our political discourses in ways that are important to understand. The view that we have rival constitutional visions is endorsed by many prominent conservative thinkers. Charles Kessler, the editor of the Claremont Review, and Charles and I overlapped in graduate school, along with Rob Vipon. Charles recently published a book that has a good name for this conference, Crisis of the Two Constitutions, and he puts this crisis as a clash between what he considers the original and true Constitution and the constitutional views that arose in the progressive era and have since developed views that emphasize living constitutionalism. The journalist Christopher Caldwell has a somewhat different story. He thinks it's really in the civil rights era of the 1960s that progressives in this country came to embrace a rival view of the Constitution that he thinks is fundamentally inconsistent with the true and original Constitution. And so I'm going to begin by laying out this kind of account between these rival constitutional visions that we hear about in current discourse. And those who have a jurisprudence of originalism or textualism and who think they are articulating the true original Constitution, they sometimes call it the traditional Constitution. I'm going to call it the view of the constitutional traditionalists, not to get into how far their views are accurate, but it is important to understand that their emphasis is on what they take to be the constitutional understandings in the original 1787 Constitution, the first 10 amendments constituting the Bill of Rights, as well as the 11th and 12th amendments. They mostly see later amendments either as an extension of these original understandings or as deviations that should be minimized or treated as trivial. And so what do they mean by this traditionalist Constitution? Well, one account is that they understand the Constitution's ends in ways that are articulated in the preamble of the Constitution as concern for peace, prosperity, liberty, and justice. But they stress that these views are grounded in certain philosophic and religious conceptions, in Enlightenment views that claim that there are rationally discernible natural laws and natural rights that never change, and in true religious understandings, which in the founding era were thought to be Christian and usually Protestant Christian. The traditionalist Constitution is understood to involve structures that include the creation of a large-scale republic with the multiple factions that are supposed to cancel each other out and prevent majority faction, and also checks on government in the form of the separation of powers and a federal system in which most governing is to be done at the state and local levels, not at the national level. And at the national level, it is supposed to be a system of popular self-governance, but a system of indirect popular self-governance, not direct democracy. People don't decide any substantive issue directly at the national level, only through representatives, so Republican and not fully Democratic. Proponents of the Traditionalist Constitution emphasize that it strengthened protections for property rights as well as patents for useful scientific innovations as part of trying to promote commercial economy that became a capitalist economy more and more, as well as a range of other rights and freedoms, both for state and local communities and individuals. But proponents of the Traditionalist Constitution today do acknowledge that the constitutional text provided some tacit support for enslaved labor systems while stressing that the term slavery wasn't used, and that their constitutional system was engaged in imperial governance of the indigenous peoples on the continent, and their constitution permitted, although it didn't directly authorize, state exclusions of women, people of color, and poor whites from full political and civil rights. And most of the proponents of the Traditionalist Constitution think most of the founders shared these basic understandings. Now, I think, along with others here, that it is a mistake to talk about the founders as too homogenous a bunch of people, and they didn't include all the people in the United States. So I think it's important to recognize that there were always a range of disputes within what's now conceived of as traditionalist American constitutionalism. Even the grounding on natural rights was controversial because there were many who were concerned from the outset that the doctrines of universal natural rights could be used to challenge too many established systems of hierarchy and authority. Many of the initial state constitutions in the Confederation era begin proclaiming natural rights. There is no such natural rights language in the Constitution itself, and that is in part because people had seen how it could be used to attack enslaved labor and other kinds of hierarchical systems to which some of the founding generation were deeply attached. At the same time, it's also true that the structures emphasizing only indirect popular self-governance were challenged from early on as insufficiently democratic by some of the Jeffersonians, but then especially by the Jacksonians. They wanted to expand democracy only to white men, but still expanding democracy. Whereas on the other hand, their opponents, the Federalists and the Whigs, pushed back against the notion that governance should be done mostly at the state and local levels. They wanted national initiatives to promote economic and commercial growth. Precisely because they did, even property rights were controversial to some extent with the Jacksonians in particular, concerned that existing doctrines of property rights favored already wealthy elites, and they wanted to create economic opportunities for the aspiring new entrepreneurs of their constituency, which involved re-legislating property rights in a variety of ways. And perhaps most fundamentally, there was always resistance to the Constitution's tacit support for enslaved labor, for imperial governance of the tribes, and for the exclusions from full political and civil rights, resistance from the members of all those groups and communities, and resistance from some white male allies. And these disputes within traditionalist American constitutionalism became engines of American political development, culminating, of course, most dramatically in the Civil War. But the current debates between rival constitutional visions leap over that and focus instead on what I'll call the third era of American Constitution making, coming in two phases, both in the progressive era that Kessler stresses, and in the era of the 60s that Caldwell talks about, even though progressives and later New Dealers were not in favor of doing lots of governing through constitutional amendments that courts might use in ways that they thought undemocratic and unjust, it is important to recognize that nonetheless the constitutional text does have amendments that embody the kind of progressive and later liberal views that the proponents of traditionalist constitutionalism denounce. The progressive era saw 4 amendments, with the 16th Amendment creating the progressive income tax that has funded a growth of national governments and an expansion of national administrative regulatory activities. It's made a more national regulatory state possible in many ways. The 17th Amendment is a movement toward democracy with direct election of senators, as is the amendment enfranchising women. The 18th Amendment, of course, imposed prohibition. That was one that the progressives gave up on after a while. But in the civil rights era, we also saw a set of amendments that furthered the push toward democratizing American constitutionalism with the 23rd Amendment giving the people of D.C. Votes in presidential elections in the Electoral College, the 24th Amendment abolishing the poll tax, and the 26th Amendment extending the vote to 18-year-olds, all expansions of democracy. And I want to suggest that most proponents of this kind of constitutional view would agree on these basic elements of early progressive constitutionalism, beginning with the fact that many of the intellectual movements of the progressive era were deeply skeptical about older notions of unchanging natural rights, not least because they were being used by courts to uphold property rights in ways that struck down progressive economic regulation, and they argued in jurisprudence for an understanding of rights fundamentally as political and legal creations that could and should be changed over time as needed so that they would continue to serve the public welfare. They're created to serve the public good, and they should be changed when they don't serve the public good. Similarly, the progressives, intellectuals at least, were skeptical about natural law and the religious legitimation of government of the traditionalist constitution. They instead legitimated government now, first and foremost, through its democratic authorization, through its service to the will of the people, while at the same time saying, well, the people can define our goals, but you need technical expertise. You need to draw on the modern sciences to have a competent understanding and administration of the means to accomplish those ends. So democracy and expertise became the touchstones of legitimacy in this vision of constitutionalism. They did explicitly say that the notion that we should have a fixed, dead constitution, as Justice Scalia liked to say, meant that constitutionalism could not serve the evolving needs and aspirations of the people. And so, therefore, we needed a jurisprudence of living constitutionalism. That was a term that they embraced, and it led them to different views about governmental structures. They were dubious about many aspects of the older system of federalism and the tripartite separation of powers, particularly of judicial power, because it was being used in the progressive era against reform legislation. They favored what Victoria referred to as the electoral constitution. They wanted most of the power to be exercised by the elected legislative and executive branches, but in alliance with a new administrative and regulatory branch of government staffed by experts and nonpartisan civil servants, systems that they tried to create at all levels, local, state, and national. But in this first progressive phase of living constitutionalism positions, the scientists and intellectuals of that era were confident that modern science and knowledge supported the superiority of European civilizations and peoples, and so the progressives used these ideas to legitimate segregation, to legitimate governance of the imperially acquired territories, governance of the native tribes, and also minority religions, generally out of the claim that the advanced white Christian civilization was engaging in tutelage of these peoples in order to ultimately contribute to their advance, at least as far as they proved able of going. Now, there were also tensions and disputes within this early progressive constitutionalism, but the most important disputes centered on this last point. Over time, both intellectual developments and political pressures domestically and internationally led to the abandonment of the view that the modern science supported the superiority of European or European-descended civilizations and peoples, and began to challenge many of the systems of hierarchy that the progressives had accepted and sometimes established. And that led, especially after World War II, to post-war liberal constitutionalism. This shares much with progressive living constitutionalism, but it has important differences. It's also dubious about fixed constitutional meanings. It is a living constitutionalist position, but it favors some new protections for what are now thought of as the human rights of traditionally disadvantaged groups, including minority races and religions, women, LGBTQ plus people, and to some degree, the native tribes. They also depart from the strong emphasis on just legislative and executive power, democratically authorized legislative and executive power of the progressives. And they now say that while legitimacy comes from following the democratically authorized fundamental values of the people, judges can help discern those fundamental values and therefore can shape living constitutionalism in light of the evolving fundamental values of the American people. And with that, they added to the scientific and administrative experts, judicial experts, as people who deserve to govern sometimes at the expense of democratic legislation. They retained the dubious stance toward federalism and the older tripartite separation of powers, but now with an even stronger emphasis on national powers, legislative and executive, and also judicial powers, as well as administrative and regulatory agencies. So these are the two models that I think are fairly widely understood to be in contestation in much contemporary constitutional and political discourse. And the traditionalists have these critiques of post-war liberal constitutionalism. They attack turning away from a dead constitution of fixed constitutional meanings because they say if we give up both older notions of unchanging natural law and natural rights and the notion of fixed constitutional meanings, then we have no reliable, enduring guides. We instead fall into a dangerous relativism in which judges and legislatures and executives and administrative agencies can do whatever they claim to be appropriate in light of current values. Traditionalists also push back at the expanded protections of human rights of traditionally disadvantaged groups. They insist more and more strongly, especially in recent years, that the efforts to aid groups that the government traditionally dominated, exploited, or excluded is a kind of unjust reverse discrimination, so that we often hear now that conservative white Christian men are the most discriminated against group in America. At the same time, they criticize the reliance by judges on discerning democratic fundamental values and on scientific experts in administrative and regulatory agencies as imposing on the country rule by unelected national elites, and they contend that's not what the Constitution meant to do or should do, and they also adamantly oppose the expanded views of national legislative, executive, judicial, administrative powers. All these are part of a big government that they see as a source of tyranny, and so there is this profound sense of fundamental opposition between these two constitutional visions. I think that there are problems with modern liberal constitutionalism. I don't think that the claim that it points in ways that can become relativistic is wrong. The fear that judges deciding what they think current values are actually boils down to saying anything goes has some merit. And I'd add, if that's a jurisprudential problem, there is a real political problem in the expansion of national governmental powers, and especially unelected judges. It is part of the phenomenon that Ron Herschel has written about as juristocracy, and it does, in some cases, leave itself open to claims of judicial tyranny inconsistent with real democratic self-governance. At the same time, the progressive and liberal forms of living constitutionalism have powerful arguments on their behalf. So what do we do with these two rival constitutional visions? Is there any way to find any kind of constitutional common ground? Well, I'm going to suggest that one answer may be to go back to the era I skipped over, the second era of American Constitution making from 1865 to 1870, the period when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were enacted. And I'm going to suggest what I know is a gross oversimplification, but I think a powerful one for understanding the ultimate significance of these amendments, that it's important to recognize that they wrote into the Constitution the political vision of the Republican Party that had come to power in the 1860 election under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, and the post-Civil War amendments reflect broadly the views of these Lincoln Republicans, and particularly the position that they took on the dispute going back to the founding era and tied to the fact that some endorsed natural rights and some were uncomfortable reading them too broadly. There's always been a debate. Is the Constitution a means to realize the goals of the Declaration of Independence, or is that a rhetorical political document that bears no real relation to the Constitution? The Lincoln Republicans insisted that the Constitution should be read as a vehicle to realize the core principles of the Declaration of Independence, and they emphasized the more universalistic and egalitarian opening principles, not the many indications of exclusion and continuing hostility toward the rights of those who weren't European descended that one can find elsewhere in the Declaration. In their 1860 platform, the Republicans said that the maintenance of the principles promulgated in the Declaration of Independence and embodied in the Constitution, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is essential to the preservation of our Republican institutions. They made it clear that they were running on the view, whether it's historically right or not, that the Constitution should be understood to realize the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And they knew that in many ways the Constitution didn't realize the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that is why they announced, even while they were viewing the Constitution in this light, that they were in favor of an amendment to the Constitution to be made by the people in conformity with what they understood its provisions, to terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery within the United States. And of course, they went on to do that with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment did not accomplish all they hoped in terms of securing basic rights to all, this Declaration of Independence sort of goal. And so they passed the second, the central post-war amendment, the 14th Amendment, which in its opening clause extends citizenship to all persons of African descent born in the United States and most other persons, although, especially with Maggie Blackhawk here, I want to acknowledge that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, was intended to permit what was in practice and continued to be imperial governance of the native tribes. They also expanded national power to secure rights. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, and they went further to secure the rights of all persons to protection against violation without due process of law or to denials of equal protection of the laws. So the notion that these are universal rights that can apply to persons as well as citizens reflected to some degree in the 14th Amendment. And the amendments also were a huge step in further democratizing the American constitutional system in a way that the progressive amendments and the amendments of the 1960s would continue to do. But the first big constitutional democratization is, of course, the 15th Amendment, extending the right of the citizens of the United States to vote without denials on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what does it mean to emphasize the Reconstruction amendments in the ways that I'm suggesting? My argument is that the Reconstruction amendments should be seen as both hinge and bridge. They reflect a turning point in American constitutionalism, but they also serve as a bridge indicating some common ground amongst these three phases of Constitution making. The reconstructed Constitution should be seen now as an instrument for realizing the goals of the Declaration of Independence, which again, at least some of the founders and many of the traditionalist constitutionalists today say that's how the Constitution should be understood. So some common ground there. The framers of the Reconstruction Amendments certainly embraced the traditionalist constitutional goals of peace, prosperity, liberty, and justice, and in fact they continued to ground them on doctrines of unchanging natural rights and natural and divine law. They didn't depart from the philosophic and religious foundational understandings of many in the founding eras. But at the same time, the Reconstruction Constitution clearly authorizes greater protection for the rights of many traditionally disadvantaged groups, especially minority races, as post-World War II living constitutionalism, liberal living constitutionalism would favor. The reconstructed Constitution is a movement toward greater national legislative and executive powers to secure rights, as in living constitutionalism. It is a move toward greater democratic self-governance by expanded voting rights and legislative power, again, as in living constitutionalism. And I think it's significant that in the recent and, of course, controversial decision striking down affirmative action in higher education, both the sharply conservative traditionalist Justice Clarence Thomas and the clearly progressive Justice Sonia Sotomayor had similar characterizations to a degree of the Civil War amendments. Clarence Thomas says we must adhere to the promise of equality under the law declared by the Declaration of Independence and codified by the 14th Amendment during the Second Founding, a term Eric Foner helped popularize, but Clarence Thomas is accepting that the Reconstruction Amendments are a second founding that is fully authoritative. And meanwhile, Sonia Sotomayor emphasizes that the Equal Protection Clause enshrines a guarantee of racial equality that marked a transformational point in the history of American democracy. So again, as kind of second founding, a hinge as we turned toward a more inclusive democracy, but one that might be seen as bridging at least some early traditionalist understandings with later living constitutionalist sort of views. And so my suggestion is that if we accept that the Reconstruction Amendments now clearly made the Constitution an instrument for securing Declaration of Independence rights, this is a conception of constitutional purpose that can and should be seen as common ground by constitutional traditionalists and by progressive living constitutionalists. Now, lest this sound too optimistic, let me immediately acknowledge that this would by no means settle very serious and deep disputes. Clarence Thomas thinks the Reconstruction Amendments mandate colorblind public policies. Sotomayor, race-conscious public policies. There continue to be disputes whether the traditionalist Constitution envisions a limited government and expansive markets, and they are to be the means for material prosperity, or do the increases in national legislative power include creation of welfare state systems as instruments to promote human prosperity and thriving? Should we have most power exercised by a big national government, or will we in fact realize democratic goals more fully through decentralized systems with more powers to state, local, tribal, and territorial autonomous self-governance? And maybe they authorize in the 14th Amendment both citizen rights and rights of persons, human rights, but exactly what combination of protection for rights of citizens versus human rights is appropriate for realizing the goals. There are still deep divisions and big battles over all these issues. But I want to suggest it may be possible, instead of seeing the proponents of on political issues as embracing a rival vision of the Constitution that you regard as fundamentally evil and wholly illegitimate, that it might be possible to say that, well, we do have some fundamentally shared constitutional goals while having deep and important differences over the means to those goals. There is some boundary to those differences. The argument that I'm making suggests that we do have to review the constitutional text as amended over time, including the Reconstruction Amendments and the later amendments, as one that goes beyond the Constitution in the first 12, the original text of the Constitution in the first 12 amendments, and establishes a constitutional project committed to extensive democratic decision-making and decision-making devoted to deciding what policies will enable each to pursue in his own way life, liberty, and happiness. That phrase, to pursue in his own way life, liberty, and happiness, is taken from one of the architects of the 14th Amendment, and it suggests that we should understand our constitutional project as this challenging project of a shared quest to achieve policies and institutions that give everyone more equal opportunities to pursue what will be diverse ways of life. Now, let me add that it is reasonable, I think, to argue, as Aziz Rana does, as Sandy Levinson does, that actually we can't hope to make this Constitution work. Somehow, we need to throw it out and get a whole new system. I certainly agree with what Ron suggested at the end, that the notion that organizing the world is in sovereign constitutional nation states, that may not be a global structure through which we can meet current problems and fulfill our broader aspirations going forward in the future. But I do think that politically it is not realistic to think that we're going to get a new Constitution. And therefore, if we're going to continue to try to guide our political life through the Constitution that we have, and if we are to end, or not end, limit the deep divisions between these rival constitutional visions, it will come only if we recognize that we can find some common ground by understanding the Constitution as dedicated above all to the goals set in the second founding through the Reconstruction Amendments. Thank you.
Time for discussion, which I look forward to. I will lightly moderate. Just a reminder as we get the microphones ready, they'll go around like last time. Good questions are short. They invite the speaker to say something, and for that reason they involve a question mark. So that's where I'll step in, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that remarkably judicious analysis of the difference between, I guess, conservative traditionalist constitutionalism and progressive constitutionalism. One complaint that will take the form of a question, I promise you. if there was one issue that I think you underplayed in terms of the distinction between traditionalist constitutionalism and progressive constitutionalism, it really is the question of the presidency and the bureaucracy. And introducing that issue sort of muddles the distinction between traditionalists on the one hand and progressives on the other. Because when I learned about the problems of bureaucratic government and the problems of the delegation of power from Congress to the executive branch, it was not from rock-ribbed Republican conservatives, it was from Ted Lowy, it was from reading David Schoenbrod. So the question then is could there be a ground of compromise in which certain types of constitutional developments, the fluidity of the Commerce Clause, the scope of national power, that's a ship that has sailed, that cannot be returned to. But the notion of having the fundamental policy choices made within Congress, within the legislative branch, is that a possible ground of compromise to your mind? And if not, what problems, what kinds of constitutional crises, let's say, do you think would emerge if the Supreme Court continues to push at that issue and to resurrect or perhaps reinvent or create out of whole cloth, whatever you want to approach it, right? The idea that Congress should make the fundamental policy decisions.
I want to take that as a friendly amendment to my talk because I have argued for a number of years that the biggest failure in American constitutional governance is the abdication by Congress of the responsibility to make lots of the basic decisions, both about goals and to a significant degree about the means that we try to accomplish through public policies. And that especially in this age of polarization, there are too many issues where Congress essentially punts to the administrative and regulatory agencies and the courts. I would like to think that it is possible for Congress to do better. There are those who say, no, modern governance is too complex and too fast changing, and Congress simply has to defer to the executive branch and to the administrative and regulatory agencies, and perhaps to the courts, although they're hardly models of efficiency and alacrity. The Biden administration in its first couple of years showed that, to my mind, that isn't so clearly inevitably the case. They passed major pieces of legislation for infrastructure, for climate change, and for relief of many of the ravages of the COVID pandemic. So I certainly want to believe that it is possible to move to a system where Congress plays its appropriate constitutional role more fully and effectively, and I hope, as you suggest, that might be seen as common ground. I do worry a little bit about those traditionalist conservatives who embrace the doctrine of the unitary executive because some of them at least play fast and loose and say, well, there's been, with living constitutionalism, all this expansion of executive and administrative and regulatory powers, and that's all bad unless our president gets total control over all of them. Proponents of that view are not necessarily going to join the Congress revival camp, but I hope many traditionalists will.
Sorry. This was really fascinating and optimistic, and I really enjoyed it. But I found myself wondering, thinking in particular about race-conscious versus colorblind constitutionalism. And I started to think, aren't those actually so opposed to one another that, you know, the sort of these two views of the 14th Amendment, that this really can't be a bridge? And I started to think, in fact, where have I read this idea that they're so opposed to one another? And I realized, of course, Rogers, this is your earlier work. So could you speak to how this, Rogers, this optimistic view of how we can come together, the 14th Amendment can serve as a bridge between these two views, relates to your earlier work, really castigating race-blind or colorblind constitutionalism as a perversion of the 14th Amendment.
Not just my earlier work. Let me take this opportunity to plug the book that I had come out this week with Desmond King called America's New Racial Battle Lines, Protect versus Repair, in which we argue that oppositions over racial policies are now more polarized than in our earlier work. And we end with a set of reflections, possible scenarios where they will lead us, and I don't think that those can be viewed as optimistic. I don't actually view this talk as optimistic. I'm not predicting that we will rally around this common ground. I'm rather saying I feel a bit grimly that if there is to be a way at all, it probably has to go through this route. I'm not sure at all that we will go this way. I share the views of those who think American constitutionalism is in a period of crisis now. But at the same time, I will note, don't overread this as too optimistic, because for me it's not, but we do argue a couple of things, that the most likely scenario for racial policies going forward moves in a conservative direction, but not in the most extreme white Christian nationalist conservative direction, although that is a real force in American politics. Rather, the kind of position taken by the folks at the Manhattan Institute, for example, is what they call multicultural conservatism or multiracial democracy, but with the idea that we will welcome a wide variety of ethnic groups, religious groups, racial groups as equal members of the American Republic, as long as they support conservative social and economic policies. So, but in some ways that's better than overt white supremacy, and it also means that they can support a certain measure of race-conscious policies, certainly aids to HBCUs. They can support some ethnic studies programs as long as there's a message that immigrants came here and succeeded, you know, rather than imperialism continues today. There are other ways in which there might be a certain common ground found on that side of the political spectrum, with at least some race-conscious measures that softens the insistence on colorblindness. Again, doesn't necessarily lead to any great progress from my point of view, but may avoid the worst. And on the liberal or progressive side, there is, of course, this long-standing division between proponents of class politics and proponents of race-conscious politics. At the same time, there is some willingness in each camp that, especially if you can build a broad coalition for economic, redistributive, and regulatory legislation that benefits those who are least advantaged in American life, including many of those damaged by neoliberal policies that are now voting for Trump. If you can push that kind of agenda, you can probably include in it some race-conscious measures that may help the advocates of race-conscious policies feel that their concerns are recognized and included to some extent. Now, neither of those scenarios is a sure road to progress, and the progressive side is not a sure road to electoral victory. But there are things to try. I think that's what I'll leave it with. Things worth trying.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk, and I was in particular intrigued by your kind of putting your finger on the ways in which some of the traditionalist critiques, thinking Charles Kessler particularly, skip right over the Reconstruction amendments and go on to like Woodrow Wilson era amendments. And I guess my question boils down to, if you're seeking to make the Reconstruction amendments sort of a bridge, of a common ground, right? How much good faith do you see on the side of the people who skip right over them to argue about 16 through 19, right? I'm just, because that move by people like Charles Kessler seems rather convenient to me, and it gets to the larger issue of cherry-picking amendments. At what point do amendments stop counting? You know, after 12, after 10? And so is there really sufficient elements of a common ground around the 13th, 14th, 15th, when people who are arguing the traditionalist view really seem to want to avoid them entirely, or maybe partly?
We'll see, but I will say, you know, Charles understands the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as the completion of what he regards as the original Constitution, as an extension of it, not a departure from it, and as an important completion. He thinks everything since is trivial or wrong-headed, but he does want to embrace those amendments. He might make an exception in terms of enfranchising women. I think that's okay. But the serious point there is that Charles will certainly understand them through a colorblind interpretation, and that won't by any means settle policy disputes over racial progress. At the same time, we interviewed him for this book. He is genuinely dismayed by what he calls the ethno-nationalist turn amongst young conservatives. You know, he talks about the glories of the American founding, and on the one hand, Patrick Deneen tells him the American founding was terrible, and a lot of the young conservatives go along. And the others say, you know, what we're interested in is this new national conservatism. And national conservatism says that every nation, it rejects universalist ideologies. Well, the Declaration of Independence is a universalist ideology. So, by the way, is the Christian religion in most understandings. So they say every nation should build on its own distinctive national traditions. And if Christianity has been historically dominant in your nation, then all public and private policies should reflect Christian values, they say. This is in their 10-point platform. And Charles gets anxious about this ethno-national turn, not least because younger conservatives find it much more exciting than his what now sound like stale pieties about the glories of the founding. And so they have the momentum in the conservative movement. He might find himself down the road in the same position that another graduate school classmate of mine, William Crystal, reached a lot sooner, which is to say, I don't have a place amongst these conservatives anymore, and therefore might be more open to finding common ground. Again, not a prediction. I'm just looking for possibilities that might be worth pursuing.
Okay. I want to stay with the 14th Amendment a little bit here. And it seems to me that immigration is one of those topics that's really going to be animating the American election next year, and or this year. Sorry, it's really coming up on us. And one of my favorite
6 months ago.
Yeah. One of my favorite articles of yours from the 80s is on this really fascinating concept of consensual citizenship that you came up with. And you know, when I look at proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution, often the first one proposed is to curtail birthright citizenship. You know, you mentioned with respect to earlier, that famous clause about subject to the jurisdiction thereof, obviously it's intended to deny citizenship to American Indians, but these days, I think, as you pointed out in that article, a lot of people would use that to deny it to temporary immigrants, undocumented immigrants, maybe American students from abroad, et cetera. And just thinking about that a little bit, it seems alive and well, and perhaps animated a little bit by the ideas that you, Peter and Shnogan, you put together in that article. I mean, thinking back on it, how are you thinking about the idea of consensual citizenship and the interpretation of that clause these days?
Well, for those of you who don't know, in 1985, Peter Schuck, the Yale Law School, and I wrote this infamous book, sharply analyzed by Joe Cairns, amongst others, which suggested that the authors of the Birthright Citizenship Clause in the 14th Amendment simply hadn't been thinking about undocumented aliens because we didn't have national immigration restrictions at that time, and so our view was that this was a question not settled by the Constitution, and that in a constitutional republic or democracy, the default position should be that it's therefore left to congressional decision-making. And I personally always favored a policy of birthright citizenship and continue to do so to this day. I did experience shock and horror at the way our argument was used by anti-immigrant movements. And I went through a period where I didn't want to continue to think about that particular issue at all. At a later point, there was this massive pile of literature criticizing our position, and I decided I should go through it and read it. And actually, I came back to the view that there's no strong case that the Birthright Citizenship Clause was consciously aimed at granting birthright citizenship to children of unauthorized aliens. So this very unpopular view is one I still hold, along with the view that the policy should be to grant birthright citizenship. There have been efforts, both by statute and by introducing constitutional amendments. We wrote this book in 1985. It went out of print. It's never been back in print. But the idea is kept alive in Congress. Some years ago, I wrote with great satisfaction that none of these efforts have gone anywhere, even when the Republicans had control of both houses of Congress under President Trump. They went nowhere. For me, it indicates you can trust democracy more than many of us have been willing to do. And I feel the same way about the fact that democracy, even in red states, has proven more supportive of women's rights to have abortions than we expected. And it relates to what I do see as a weakness of progressive liberal constitutionalism. It has empowered decisions by non-elected national elites, judges and administrators, in ways that have been out of touch with the concerns of many Americans. And I think liberals and progressives need to focus more on building broad democratic coalitions to accomplish their goals. And that's what I continue to think should be done and can be done successfully on the issue of birthright citizenship.
Thank you very much for an excellent summary of the change in the, especially with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment by Nixon, by Abraham Lincoln. You know, we academics, we like theoretical clarity. And I wish you had defined democracy and republic more clearly, because these two are totally incompatible. And my short question really is, do you not think that all political crises of the West since Socrates have been a fight between democracy and republic. And I would like to preface what I mean by
Please.
Socratic. Democracy is the rule of the demos, which Socrates opposed, which is basically the rule of the 5% married males. And republic, he thought it was inefficient. And he suggested a republic, which is the rule of the public through the learned, the philosophers and all that. And obviously he was defeated, right? And I think that the American Revolution, really was the republic of the demos, which basically Magna Carta type thing, which had to be corrected by Lincoln in order to extend and bring the Socratic Republic. Now, what happened is that, I'm sure you know history, that the change from 1870 onwards, especially juridically, was devastating because the democracies like peace and law, whereas the republic like rights and individual freedom, right, and justice. And juridically, with Oliver Holmes, the course became from courts of justice to law. And especially with the three Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, they were both Republicans, moneyed, and the Republican Party changed into a party pushing democracy. And obviously the Democratic Party started to push Republican values with the civil rights movement. So do you not think that clarity will be aided if democracy and republic are used in their precise ways?
Well, first, I have to note, since you're rightly insisting on rigorous use of terms, that we can't pretend that there's one single clear authoritative understanding of democracy or republic. There are different understandings of these terms through U.S. history, through Western history. Now, the opposition that you set up, I think, is a real one between concerns to have sort of participatory mass self-governance and some kind of rule by elites that present themselves as wiser and cooler heads, and sometimes maybe more concerned to protect some fundamental aspects of justice that can be overridden in the passions of the moment, even while they may well define justice in self-serving ways. So I think that it's fair to say that if you want, disputes between masses and elites have been fundamental through all political history, and you can look at the political sociologies of figures like Machiavelli and Hobbes, but also Pareto and many in the modern social sciences, and you can see this mass-elite distinction as ongoing characterization of the empirical realities of politics. What do we make of it? What I take away from it is wariness about saying that one team is always better than the other in these conflicts. There have certainly been excesses of mass democracy. You can argue that before the enfranchisement of African Americans and women, we didn't really have mass democracy. We had the empowerment of a limited set of the population over others. But it can't be denied that even after those enfranchisements, we had lynching as a American tradition that was had a kind of mass base. That's clearly unjust, restrained to some degree, ultimately by the legal and political system, although I'll note that we didn't get a national law passing lynching until very recently, when the custom had long since passed away. And it's most vivid forms. And so I am, I think we should understand that there's this a plausible case for this kind of fundamental political sociology, but I think our task is to channel these conflicts as constructively as possible rather than presenting either side as the sole possessors of the path to the good. You may reasonably disagree. Yeah. Sir.
Thank you, Rogers. I really enjoyed that presentation, as the three presenters earlier on today. I was very taken by the sense of hope, maybe to build on here. Particularly, you had to go back in history to go back to the so-called Reconstruction. Interesting terminology when we're thinking about the Constitution, but you're talking about effects in a broad scheme. And there seemed to be that common ground to some degree you're talking about. That's hopeful, because sometimes you hear that a lot in human history, where there can be moments where breakthroughs can happen. And I wanted to give us some solace, I should say, though, of course, it's not guaranteed. My question comes with, as a Canadian, I'm not a historian or a politician or legally strong or any of those things, but for over my 6 decades, I've been very struck as I look south of the border in my occasional visitations, how strong the sense of the Constitution is to everyday Americans. You can hear it in the media and TV, but it's for people who talk very strongly about that. And part of what we're hearing today is this fractured sensibility, its weaknesses. Are we talking crisis? What do we do? What is your sense of everyday Americans in terms of their sense of the Constitution, where it seems for much of my encounters, they have felt very good about it, though maybe that's changed in the last 10 or 20 years. Any thoughts on everyday Americans?
Well, I am not a scholar of public opinion, and I'm all too conscious that I've lived most of my adult life in the all too insular chambers of what proclaim themselves to be elite universities. So I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this question. I will say my impression is that the kind of reverence for the Constitution that its founders actively tried to inculcate, but that Aziz Rana's book does show, didn't really take hold in as big a way as they hoped until the mid-20th century, really. You know, most of the progressives didn't like the Constitution very much. FDR turned that around by reinterpreting the Constitution so it supported the New Deal and claiming he was returning to its original principles, and that pattern has endured since. We still have a culture where probably a lot of people continue to, in the abstract, say the American Constitution is a good thing, but we have more pessimism about the American political system, and especially amongst younger Americans and their prospects for the future, than we have had probably in my lifetime. So I don't think that that is creating a public mood to write a new Constitution, as some of our friends would like us to do, but it does mean that the phenomenon you describe, my guess is receding, not gone, but receding. No?
I had kind of a similar question. I'm from Louisiana, and now I'm a professor at University of Toronto, so it's a weird existence. And when I go back, I talk to people about the Second Amendment and things like this. And the argument that we have is always within. It's within the terms of the Constitution. What does it say? What does it not say? And so often I'll present another piece of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that they haven't considered that much, and then there's a debate about what are the bounds and this kind of a thing. And so to follow up on this question, I think, I don't think of this as a constitutional crisis, because I think of democracy as being agonistic. There's always a struggle between sides. It's always cast in, various, almost approaching antagonism. But as long as we stop short of violence, it's democracy at work. Is that the wrong way of thinking about this? I don't think that there are people that are calling for overturning the Constitution or writing a new one or saying that we should, there are small rebellions in the United States, but they're not big ones. There are militia movements and they're not growing as far as I could tell. Am I wrong about this? Isn't this democracy?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Next question. No, the militia movements grew under Trump. They did then plateau, but they are reorganizing now, and they're working effectively at the local level. And we did risk a violent overthrow of the duly elected government on January 6th. It didn't go far enough to represent an imminent danger of a successful coup, but we were far less prepared to cope with it than I expected. I knew there would be massive demonstrations on January 6th. Trump had been calling for them. I never believed that they would be able to invade the Capitol and stop the process and tear up offices. And if that could happen, I'm not sure it could have gone, that it was impossible for it to go a few steps further, in which case we would have had violent defeat of democracy. And political violence more generally is on the rise in the United States today. This is something that we look at in our book. It is different from the turbulent era of the 1960s and 70s when I came of age. I won't say grew up, but I came of legal age, and in those days there was significant violence on the left as well as on the right. Right now the violence is overwhelmingly on the right. It's not absent on the left, but it is much, much less, and it's much less organized. You don't have the same kind of organized militia groups that you do on the right. But I'm not sure that pattern will hold if Trump comes back into power, because he has announced that he feels entitled to terminate parts of the Constitution. He has announced that he's going to engage in an extensive purge of the federal government, eliminating those who disagree with him. He's announced that he'll be a dictator at least for day one. Some of those, you might say, are Trump hyperbole, but Trump is the leader of a movement that includes many people who accept that they represent a minority of Americans, but they think that they represent a minority that is entitled to rule because those other people aren't real Americans and shouldn't be Americans. And so I think that there is a real danger that if Trump comes into power, there will be a deliberate effort to consolidate permanent minority rule on behalf of that party, and that it will be resisted by violence on the left. Not so optimistic.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm going to try and ask a quick question because we both have a question. All right, I'll try it. So I appreciated very much the idea that the Declaration and the Reconstruction Amendments might allow us to find common ground today, but I wondered if I could press you a bit on the we there, and also whose declaration you're talking about, and if your proposal may, in some ways, be more inclusive if it were to incorporate not just the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments' vision of the Declaration, but the abolitionists, both black and white, who gave voice and life to the Declaration during the movement for those Reconstruction Amendments and beforehand for the abolition of slavery. And part of that is also just thinking about who might even be continued to be excluded from your proposal. So not just the abolitionists of having a voice within constitutionalism, because we're looking only at who formally ratified it, even though that constitutional process was itself a failure, as we later came to see, but also women. You know, does it incorporate the 19th Amendment also in your Reconstruction amendments? And even then, it was a little bit short-sighted. And then also Native people, so the idea of merciless Indian savages in the Declaration, right, who were then subject to the jurisdiction thereof under the 14th Amendment. Is there another space for that? Oh.
Absolutely. There's not just a space for it, it's essential to the kind of understanding I'm talking about. In ways that might threaten the effort to achieve common ground, but I think it can still be understood as a difference over means, and traditionalists will be forced to concede that these should be seen as constitutional goals. In terms of the Declaration of Independence, my argument is that the exigencies of the revolutionary movement trying to build broad support led the revolutionaries to articulate principles that went beyond what they were prepared to implement. And that subsequently, the fact that they did so has become a part of American culture that has proven a great resource for reform movements throughout history, including black and white abolitionists, including women's movements, including labor movements, including movements up to the present day. You know, the Black Panthers' 1966 platform culminates in an appeal to the Declaration of Independence. In this talk, I presented the Reconstruction Amendments as the vision of the Lincoln Republicans, and I don't think that's wrong. I think it's important to understand that the views of the Lincoln Republicans were already shaped by black and white abolitionists. Lincoln didn't go as far as Lysander Spooner or Frederick Douglass, but he both did come to articulate his version of anti-slavery constitutionalism under their influence, and he moved closer to Douglass's views in the most critical period of his life. So through 1862, he's still talking about colonization. The final speech he gives, he says that he favors at least limited enfranchisement of African Americans, and because he took that position, John Wilkes Booth shot him. That represented a move which he credited himself to the influence of Frederick Douglass and other voices. And so when I talk about the vision of the Reconstruction Amendments, a fuller account has to acknowledge that those elements are incorporated to some degree. And remember, I'm talking about the Reconstruction Amendments as a centerpiece, a bridge and hinge for the whole Constitution. It doesn't mean that we ignore the later amendments. Rather, my hope is that we understand the later amendments as an extension of a project that is begun but not completed with the Reconstruction Amendments. So they are fulfillment of, partial fulfillment, still a long way to go, of the aspirations to make the republic a more democratic republic, a republic that secures the rights of more than just the original white settler male colonial core. If those elements weren't understood as part of the direction I am suggesting, I would not be suggesting it.
Thank you, Rogers. It's always really enlightening to listen to you, and so I wanted to follow up more in the direction of political sociology, and you know, you talked a lot about ideas and about constitutional provisions and constitutional amendments, and perhaps ask you a bit about the political economy of it all, and in particular the urban-rural divide, and to what extent it is an independent factor in, so when we go back to the graphs, not now, but in our minds, go back to the set of graphs that you presented at the outset, the widening common grounds and
Right.
all that, polarization, and we see that the rise of this is parallel or contemporaneous to the re-emergence of
Right.
the rural-urban divide, and then we see the same phenomenon in many of the countries that have fallen into the same problem. And so I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think that this is about the economy and not about conflicting constitutional visions, or maybe there is a place to political economy factors in all of this, and to what extent, however non-imaginable this may be, a massive New Deal, a massive redistribution of resources across the country is going to, in 20, 30 years, you know, it's a long process, address the issue.
So remember, I started by saying that I thought polarization had many more sources than simply differences over constitutional visions. And I wouldn't title this talk Crisis of the Two Constitutions in the way Charles did his book, because that would suggest that the constitutional vision conflicts were at the heart of modern polarization. And I don't think that's true. I do think they're a contributing factor. I can't give you an informed assessment of relative weights, but I think polarization is driven probably more by the reign of neoliberal policies that bears some relationship to the juristocratic elements I was talking about, but it's part of the same neoliberal elites worldview, but much more important in making many rural Americans feel, to some degree rightly, that they have been neglected in national policy making. Now, you have to qualify it a little bit by recognition that they are nonetheless overrepresented in national decision making. So, you know, to some degree, I think they need to blame themselves for voting for all these rich people that actually served a neoliberal agenda at their expense. But nonetheless, I do think those political economy factors are big drivers of polarization, and especially the rural-urban divide. And I'm basically a New Deal Great Society liberal. I think that if we had many more efforts to address those problems, we might be able to diminish some of those divisions over time.
Unfortunately, we have to end it there. These were fantastic questions, and I think they were a testament to a really rich and thought-provoking talk. So please join me in once again thanking Roger Smith.
Thank you.